The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for our webcast entitled Emerging Markets, which is part 3 of a special 3-part webinar series. I'm Jaren Hart, Sales and Marketing Manager at Denison Consulting, and I'll be hosting your webinar today. We're very excited to have Dan Denison here with us to discuss some key learnings from his best-selling book, Leading Culture Change in Global Organizations. On this note, I wanted to inform you that we'll be randomly selecting 3 individuals from today's attendee list to receive free signed copies of Dan's book. I'll talk more about this at the end of the webinar. But before we get started, I just wanted to touch on a few technical items. Dan will present for about 45 minutes and will then answer questions submitted by our audience for about 15 minutes following his presentation. To submit questions for this Q&A session, use the questions control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. It would be great if you could submit these questions throughout the presentation rather than waiting until the end, just so that we can move right into the Q&A session and address as many of your questions as possible. So now to get started, I'd like to introduce you to today's speaker, Dan Denison. Dan is chairman and founding partner at Denison Consulting and is also professor of management and organization at IMD in Lausanne, Switzerland. He's written several books, including Corporate Culture and Organization Effectiveness, published by John Wiley in 1990. Dan has published the Denison Organizational Culture Survey and the Denison Leadership Development Survey based on this research, which have been used by over 5,000 organizations. And his writings have appeared in a number of leading journals, including the Academy of Management Journal, the Academy of Management Review, Organization Science, Organizational Dynamics, the Journal of Organization Behavior, Human Resource Management, and Policy Studies Review. So at this point, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Dan to get us started.
Okay, thank you, Jaren, and delighted to have you join us this morning for this third of our 3-part webinar series on our new book, which has had successful launch here just in the last few weeks. We're making our way on to some of the bestseller lists in this. We've finished the arrangements for a couple of translations. Brazilian, Portuguese, and Russian are underway, and we're talking about 3 or 4 others in Spanish and Chinese and French. So and Japanese. So things are off to a good start. A lot of interesting things have happened over the last month or so. And you know, we're excited to have you all join us today for the third in the webinar series that focuses in on emerging markets. And for those of you that have seen or looked through the first couple of webcasts, you know, you get a good idea of what the book is all about as an overview. There's 6 themes: supporting the front line, creating strategic alignment, creating one culture out of many, exporting culture change across national boundaries, and then the 2 that we'll focus on today that are building a global business in an emerging market and building a global business from an emerging market, the GE Healthcare China case and Vale is the final case in this. And the first 2 webcasts have each covered 2 of these themes, and those are available online if you want the slides, the presentation, the question and answer, and the discussion. One other thing that's key to what this book is all about and what's new in here is that we've really focused our attention when it comes to changing organizations to looking at the organization as a bundle of rituals, habits, and routines. In a lot of ways, rituals and habits and the routines that we go through each day in an organization are a micro level of the culture, but that's where the change actually takes place. And this is a perspective that we develop from doing these different chapters in the book, the cases in the book, and the themes. And it's one that we're now using with many different organizations where we're helping them understand their sort of, good old habits that they need to preserve and strengthen, and, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and those bad old habits that were great for adapting to the world, 20 years ago or 2 years ago or 200 years ago, but aren't very useful for the future. And then to also distinguish those from those good new habits that we need to invent and perfect. And to recognize also that when organizations are trying to change, they don't always get it right the first time. Maybe you do, but most people don't. And so when you develop some new habits that are actually not working or bad new habits, then the action agenda is to rethink and try again. So this is the perspective that we've developed from this. We spent a bit of the presentation in the second webinar on habits specifically. So if you're interested, go back to that or get in touch with us, because we can also always just send you all of the slides in that and point you to the different parts of the book that address that most clearly. But today what we want to do is talk about the two emerging market cases. There's no business that I've worked with over the past few years that isn't highly concerned with emerging markets. In a lot of ways, they have emerged. It's a global playing field, and one of the things that we discuss in the book is the BCG Global Challengers list. About 4 years ago, Boston Consulting Group started creating what they called the Global Challengers list, and that was a list, each year of the top companies that had their origins in emerging markets, but were new players on the global scene. The second case we'll talk about today, Vale, was one of the companies on that list the first year. More about Vale here in a few minutes. But by the third year, who was new on that list was still interesting, but they also started to form a Global Challengers alumni list that are companies where, 3 years ago they were emerging global challengers. Now they're just big global players in their industry that sort of happen to have come from what we call emerging markets. ArcelorMittal is an interesting example. When that acquisition happened, that was big news. How could an Indian company take over a major player in the European steel industry? Well, they did. It happened, and now that's just a feature of the global steel business. To help encourage your interest in emerging markets, we reference the BCG Global Challengers list and report that they publish every year now. Go and check it out. If the companies that are in your industry that are on that list are not very familiar to you, they need to be now. And those names on that list 1 year have an interesting way of becoming familiar to us over the next couple of years. So have a look. Today we want to look at two specific cases. The first one from GE Healthcare China, and the second one from Vale in Brazil. And the GE Healthcare China one is an interesting case because this is a big established global player rooted in the West, GE, that's trying to establish a global position in the anesthesia market. And they are moving into China for several reasons. The first one is because it's a big market. and that they want to enter and put a dominant position together in what they call the value segment of the anesthesia market. Now you have to understand, anesthesia is a pretty basic part of medical practice. In the West, you know, we've had this luxury for many years. In the emerging markets, developing world, an economical, you know, low-end anesthesia machine basically brings the possibility of surgery to rural markets, to, you know, less developed markets. It's extremely difficult to design this kind of technology in the West. At IMD this last year and in our consulting practice, you know, we've worked with many companies that are trying to understand what's the relationship between the products that they sell in emerging markets and the products that they sell in mature markets. So, you know, should the price point for a company's product be half in an emerging market? Should it be 10%? Should they be co-branded? Should they have acquire a local brand? And these are some of the most important, you know, strategic decisions that businesses are making with respect to how they enter emerging markets. So GE Healthcare China case brings a number of these themes together. So we want to spend a few minutes with this today in the first half of our webinar. GE entered the anesthesia business about 10 years ago by acquiring a Finnish company called Datex Omeda. Datex Omeda is sort of the leader in Western Europe, high-end, middle to high-end of the anesthesia market. And that was when GE first entered the anesthesia business. Before that, they were in strong player in medical equipment, but not in anesthesia. 2006, GE decided to enter China. They had sold some of their Datex Omeda equipment there, but they entered China in a big way by acquiring Zymed, a family-run business that was in Wuxi. Wuxi is one of those, you know, small, you know, Chinese cities that you haven't heard of only 5 million people. It's a couple hour and a half outside of Shanghai. And interestingly enough, Zymed adopted their technology, quote unquote, from Datex Omeda. You know, GE lawyers would use some different words to describe this rather than adopted, because clearly the technology that Zymed put into the lower end of the market reflected a lot of the, you know, Datex Omeda technology leader, but still hit the target for the, you know, the value segment of the market in a way that GE and Datex Omeda could not. Zymed was simple, big dream, family company. There were, you know, 3 or 4 children of the founder. Each of them were good salespeople. They divided up the country. They sold through a really big network of distributors. They did really well financially. But how do you scale this up so that this is a part of the GE global anesthesia business, and furthermore so that it's a base for the emerging market strategy and for the value segment in that business. So to do this, they hired a Finnish guy called Matti Lehtinen as the general manager of the business in China, and the guy that he replaced was a total marketing and sales guy. Little attention on kind of quality, operations, cost, and that the task of integrating Zymed, Datex Omeda into GE corporate culture was one that Matti was much better suited for. Interesting person, because Matti, went, when he was a university student on a Finnish government scholarship to study in Beijing, and he's been here ever since. His wife's Brazilian, and so their home language is Mandarin. That's the way that they communicate. So he brings together a really interesting combination of cultural characteristics here. He also knows the anesthesia business. He even has spent some time working with some of the people in a part of Datex Omega. So a really interesting choice, just in terms of the cultural characteristics of the individual chosen as a leader. You need someone who's, Finnish, engineer, Chinese, knows anesthesia, small, very specific set of capabilities that were really well suited to this. But one of the challenges of this is that GE underestimated the quality problems. At one point, they had to stop shipping. DO machines were high quality. The quality problems weren't there. The CSW Zymed products were, a design that they inherited. And this is where their biggest challenge was. As one of their engineers said, we have to put 90% of our resources on maintenance. How can they do the product development that they need to create a product that's, that's going to be have fewer quality problems and is eventually going to lead them to the point where they could get FDA approval to sell in either the U.S. or Western Europe on this value segment product. That's a huge transition for them to make. But if they're going to be able to build a business in China, and then if they're going to be able to use China and Wuxi as a platform for selling in the rest of the emerging market world, in Brazil, in India, in Russia, this is what they have to do. And so this is the struggle. The survey results that we got in late 2007 show a really interesting pattern. The leadership team pretty strongly on board with this. They're learning fast. They see the strategy. They see the goals. They have the core values and principles. Capability is a big problem, as it is in many Chinese organizations. Coordination is quite hard for them too. They're trying to manage two different products, DO and Zymed, and integrate that into GE corporate. A lot of coordination challenges with that. And the customer, the focus on the customer, not very strong in this. And you see that at the leadership team level. Even though overall they have a fairly strong perspective on the organization. Well, like in many organizations, the muddle is in the middle. The managerial and supervisory group here, the middle managers in the organization, really aren't quite sure how to connect this big picture strategy with the reality on the ground of several different products that they're making, a lot of quality challenges, hard to get the engineering resources they need. And in R&D, we see a similar set of challenges that everyone sees across the board in vision, customer focus, and capability. And in general, scores that are somewhere in between. The competition for good engineering talent in this situation is so fierce, so hard to bring people to any organization. And the fact that they were located in Wuxi rather than directly in the middle of Beijing or Shanghai or Hong Kong, Guangzhou, they had a real challenge there to build the team that they needed. Given this quick overview of the situation, I want to put you to work here and ask you what you would do in this situation. Should you lead with strategy, with structure, with vision, with quality? What are the choices? What do you think is the best approach? If you were Matti Veipanen, which approach would you take? And as you can see, the polls popped up on the screen. So please let us know what you think, and then we'll continue our discussion.
So we'll give you about 15 more seconds to respond, and then we'll close the poll. All right.
Interesting. 25% of you said yes, let's lead with strategy. No one said let's lead with structure. 55%, about half, said lead with vision. And 20% said lead with quality. Congratulations, you got it right. Voting works. As you can see in the next slide, he did decide to lead with vision. And while that's the choice that most of you made in this, I've got to tell you, this was not a very popular choice. How can you ignore the quality problems that are going around us every day? When you have a quality problem with an anesthesia machine, this is a serious, this is not like when your car won't start. This is a serious, life-threatening problem in this. And those were coming fast and furious every day. GE has a few people around, too, around the world that think they know quite a bit about quality. They have lots of offers of help and attention, not so many offers of resources, and that the approach of structure, was also one where when you look from a Western perspective into emerging markets, you tend to manage what you know how to manage, and structure and drawing pictures and charts, organization charts, very popular, lots of help, lots of attention with that. They did create lots and lots of structure in this, no question about it, but that alone is not going to solve the problem. Strategy, there's definitely a part of the vision approach that they took that did have a lot to do with strategy, so I think there's a case for that as well. But what they did wasn't all that well received, in the sense that Matti spent a lot of time talking about the long-term purpose and vision of the organization in town hall meetings with all of the employees that were on site there. And a lot of impatience that we really needed to get to the business issues of the day now, and not be having and planning another town hall meeting next week or next month. The rationale in this, which from your response, you can probably explain as well or better than I can, but that if you didn't paint a picture of a future where the interests of the three components of this converged, where the value segment, Zymed product, and the Datex Omeda higher end product, and the GE corporate strategy converged, then it was really hard to get anyone to move. It was really hard to get people to think about how to plan that future together. So really interesting choice of leading with vision and of emphasizing that. One other point that stands out in this case is the way that they reacted to the results. I mean, as you can see from now I'm backing up one slide, but as you can see, they focused on these challenges of vision and purpose, customer focus, and capability development. And when Matti looked at those results, he said, "Well, I know what this means." And I said, "Well, you know, what? I mean, tell me." He said, "Well, this means we should do more of something we're already doing." And, okay, what's that mean? He says, "Well, we're starting to send a few of our engineers, key engineers, to spend a day in an operating room so they can see how the equipment is used. They can understand it from the customer point of view. We should do that with everyone." And it's interesting from several standpoints. One is that it's quite visionary. It's saying, let's step back and invest in people's understanding of the purpose of their work, the purpose of all their hard work and effort. It's also interesting because a lot of times organizations will say, well, give us the 12 silver bullets that will address each of these 12 indexes in the model. What do we do to improve organizational learning? What do we do to improve empowerment, and so on and so forth? And we give lots of suggestions of how specific organizations have done that. But it's also a great illustration that action can address a number of these issues all at the same time. That one action speaks to this combination of three challenges. Because when an engineer spent a day in an operating room, they understood the complex set of customers that they have to respond to. Healthcare in China has a lot of similarities to healthcare anyplace else in the world. You have the patients, you have the doctors, you have the hospitals, you have the insurers, and that they need to see all of those pieces, because any one of those can influence the work that they do. And then finally, capability development. When they invested in engineers having this experience, that changed their recruiting process. That changed their pitch to the talent that they had to bring on board if they were going to be able to realize this global vision. That gave them something to say that a lot of their competition couldn't, which was that they would invest in people. They were concerned about the customer. They were concerned about the patients, the doctors, and the long-term purpose of the organization. And so that's quite an interesting step that they took. They did many other things as well. But this helped everyone see that if their work is successful, they can save lives. If it's not, they can really harm people. And he hit all three of those at the same time with this. What happened with this? Well, you can see that over a period of not very long, 14, 15 months, they made a big step forward in this, especially in the management ranks, the middle management ranks. That's where people really started, it had the biggest impact. That's where people really started to see the purpose, started to believe that it was worth all of the effort to try to develop one production process for 2 levels of equipment, and to integrate all of that with the brilliant world-class process expertise that GE had, but in some ways was much more than they could absorb. What they found was that leading with process was much harder. The 3 parts of the organization, GE, DO, Zymed, CSW, were 3 very different mindsets, and they were in competition. Once they had a vision, they could start to work towards this, but they went through a tremendous struggle where they had 3 solutions for almost everything in this. So the interesting part about this is that GE, Datex Omeda, Zymed all of them are operating in China. Some of it, particularly with GE corporate, does reflect a national culture difference, but a lot of it is about the culture of the organizations. This is a success story in this. They began exporting machines from China to India, then started to develop the market in Brazil, then Russia. And, you know, where's Matti today? Well, last year, about 4 years, 3.5, 4 years after he started this job, he runs the global anesthesia business. And so this has been very successful. It's built a global business. It all started with entering an emerging market. I think there's some lessons we can take away from these. Vision is powerful. It takes quite a bit of courage. You are always going to get a lot of pressure to deal with the short term, deal with it now, and you have to. But leading with the vision proved to be a powerful part of their success once they got over the initial resistance. Being able to operate in the cultural context, you know, Matti brought a combination of engineering, GE, Finnish, Mandarin, anesthesia, to this. All of those are strong cultural influences that he understood well. The speed of change. This happened over really a period of 2 or 3 years. The complete transformation. Things move very, very quickly at sort of hyper speed in emerging markets, and that's a big adjustment for people who are comfortable with the pace of change in Europe or North America. The subcultures, organizational subcultures that you see having such a strong influence in this are everywhere around the world, and don't, you know, let the cultural differences, the language differences ever make you think that all Brazilians, all Swiss, all Americans, all Chinese are the same. See those differences. I think the final lesson is that they did quite well at acquiring a competitor. Basically, they purchased their pirate in this, and they made it work. And quite interesting, because the infighting was somewhat limited, I think, by the attention on the vision. Okay, so that's an overview of GE. Let's turn our attention a little bit now to Vale. Vale, 10 years ago, was a department in the Brazilian government that ran a set of mines in Brazil. The headquarters are in Rio. The mines aren't in Rio. You know, very, very strong kind of fiefdoms built around the mines. That's where they started. Today, and for the last 5 years, Vale's control about 25% of the world trade in iron ore, one of the most basic natural resources. And Vale's one of the, you know, top 5 mining companies in the world, with a market value of, I don't know, 300 billion or something like that. So how did this happen? The early changes in Vale were, you know, about the vision to be a global player and not a bunch of, you know, bureaucrats that were working for the government and controlling some of the mines. Professionalization is a constant drumbeat through this, because to play at a global standard, you have to bring the global talent together. Standardization within Brazil got a lot of attention. Vale was their kind of corporate university. Education and development was a critical part of this. And the international expansion during this period, 2000 to 2006, was mostly about exploring markets outside Brazil, about doing a few smaller acquisitions and getting, familiar with relocating expats, moving people around, but still at a pretty exploratory stage. Their culture survey results in 2006 for Vale show a real mix. They show incredibly clear strategy, very strong vision. You see their level of aspiration here. They also, think that they have a tremendous amount of capability, and they do. But when you look at that on a global scale, it's a bit more challenging standard to meet. Along about this time, Vale also did the biggest acquisition they had done by far. They acquired one of Canada's leading mining companies, a nickel company called Inco. It was the biggest acquisition ever done in either Brazil or Canada. And when you look at their results, there are some similarities. I mean, neither of them are all that flexible. The main difference that you see, though, is kind of on the bottom half of the model. Inco, much more kind of participative, empowering, team-based culture among these Canadians, and the consistency with which they operated was dramatically different from Vale. So the question I'd like to pose here to you is that, they have just made a huge acquisition. They've had some experience developing with smaller acquisitions, getting their own house in order in Brazil, but this is a huge step. How are you going to manage this? The choices that we'd like you to consider is that first you could say, let's just keep these operations independent. They're too different. I mean, after all, iron ore and nickel, that's different business, Canada and Brazil. Keep it independent. You could also have a Brazilian team come to Canada to manage the Inco business. You could also have the top management team for this business unit come to Rio. That way you would have close coordination with the whole corporate strategy. And then the fourth one is the mix. Move some Brazilians to Canada, some Canadians to Rio. What do you think? What approach would you take to integrating Vale and Inco?
We'll give you about 10 more seconds to respond, and then we'll close the poll.
Wow. A few, one or two, a few votes here for keep the operations independent. A few for building a Brazilian management team in Canada. No one for moving the Canadians to Rio, even during the winter. And, a mix, moving some one way, some the other. I guess it's, it's probably most accurate to say that you got this one right again, because in the end there was a mix, but it's amazing how difficult it was, and how really how independent the operations remained, even as they started to move a few people around. They had some early situations where they did move Canadian leaders to Brazil. It didn't work very well. It was a huge change. the biggest challenge was how to represent Inco in the overall corporate strategy. It became a huge part of their business. It wasn't very well understood. A lot of, while they didn't move a entire Brazilian management team to Canada, the Canadians did get a lot of attention. There were lots of visitors. There were 2 or 3 members of the management team that were Brazilian that did move to Canada. But lots of review, lots of visitors from Brazil. And there's some interesting stories we talked about in the book about miscommunications. The word for question in Brazilian Portuguese, there's sort of a couple ways to translate it. I mean, pergunta is one way to translate it, but another more common one is dúvida. And, you know, dúvida is also translated as doubt directly into English. And so they had a lot, the main kind of activity that took place is a lot of Brazilians coming to Inco saying many times, or at least the message they heard is, well, we have doubts about some financial issues. We have doubts about operational concerns. We have doubts about the strategy. We have doubts about the structure. And it took 6 months to understand this difference in translation, where when they ask for more, when Brazilians ask for more information, the Canadians thought that they were questioning them, even questioning their honesty or integrity. And so the complexity of making this work was really a challenge. The other factor here is that when Inco was acquired by Vale, they read the news and they said, who are these guys? I think one of the things that's very unique to building a global business from an emerging market is that when you enter the market, no one knows who you are. They also, in Inco's case, this is clearly true. I mean, there's few people that have maybe, been to Brazil on holiday. They could find, Brazil on the map, but the knowledge of what Brazilian culture was like was very limited. Starting point was very minimum. Nonetheless, you can see thank you. You can see the changes that they took on to incorporate Vale and to continue to build a global presence. They invested a lot, again, in professionalization, standardization at a global level, in leadership training at MIT and IMD. That's how we first became involved with them. And this period was incredibly innovative and dynamic, but it was really about the Brazilian team learning, how to become a global company. Their aspiration and the strength of their base was a great start, but not nearly enough to carry the day. It took a lot of work. 2008, you see that they made some substantial improvements on this, particularly on being more flexible, being more empowering in this, being more global and in some ways less Brazilian. And you also see a really interesting convergence here, because Vale and Vale Inco starting to look more similar in this. They did make progress on creating one business, managing those together. Some of the lessons from this is the first stage for an emerging market company trying to go global is to put your own house in order. Creating a professional company, creating one company with Vale, the whole first stage of eliminating the individual minds and the fiefdoms that were built around them to build one organization. That was the foundation for this. Professionalism, empowering people that are different from you is also essential to this. And a hard-driving and visionary CEO, you can't underestimate how big an influence this was. Leadership at the top of this company was, relentless, incredible level of energy, a lot of understanding, a lot of empathy along the way, quite flexible and dynamic, but leadership at the top, there's really no substitute. So those are our comments on the Vale case and an overview of some of the themes that we get to in the book. And I think now we should turn to some of the questions and take a few of those here in our last 10 minutes or so.
Thank you so much, Dan. Yeah, I think we have about 10 minutes. So if you want to submit some questions, please do. We already have a handful. So why don't we just dive right in? We have a question from Bert who asks, are there key learnings from the GE Healthcare China intervention and our own challenges with diverse stakeholder groups in the USA? Is there an opportunity to utilize the Denison culture assessment with the power figures in our own healthcare issues?
Yikes, there's a lot of questions there, Bert, all in one. I think the part of this that we do have a lot of projects that we do in different parts of the healthcare industry. The challenges and the opportunities are huge, and that's a big part of our practice. I think the one lesson that's in this is, in GE is Matti Lehtinen bringing so many different cultural elements. I mean, you have job descriptions that say, that they need sort of, BU, GM experience, strategic spreadsheets, financial planning, et cetera, et cetera. Most organizations are very good at putting those in formal descriptions. It's far less common to say what's the cultural, prescription, or what's the cultural competencies that are central to being successful in a role. If you're talking about challenges with diverse stakeholder groups in the USA, the implication of that is if you have partners with each of those diverse stakeholder groups that are part of your decision-making team, those challenges can turn into opportunities pretty quickly. I think that mapping in to the stakeholders with your own management team is always important. It's a great question. There's a lot of different things in there that I haven't addressed, but thank you.
Great, and I see that Vancho has asked a question. Is there information on GE's or Vale's financial or market performance over the culture shift time period then and now?
Yes, yeah, there's quite a bit of that in the book. In Vale's case in particular, it's a growth from an organization that might have a market value of $2 or $3 billion to one that has $200 or $300 billion. So it's an incredible growth story. GE, the growing global sales in different emerging markets from this base is probably the most persuasive financial and business performance evidence.
Okay, great. Tom has asked an interesting question. He wonders, these issues with culture integration in emerging markets seem very similar to domestic or non-emerging markets. Do you see any critical differences?
Yeah, I think that in a lot of ways, that is one of the key conclusions of this. I mean, sure, in GE, for example, most of this discussion is going on in Mandarin. There are a lot of practices and a lot of ways things are done that you need to learn. You need some familiarity with the cultural capability that Mati brought to this was a key part of his being able to adjust to it. But many of the issues are identical to what you'd see in a mature market. The pace, the amount of time you have to resolve them is very different. It's much less. The amount of resources that you may have to resolve these issues, much less. The stakes for getting it right versus getting it wrong, much higher. But I think one of the great lessons of kind of all of our research is that there are a lot of common themes that go across the emerging markets and mature markets. And I think that the challenge is for people that come from a mature market background is to see them accurately in context and be able to act effectively to manage. There's many specific things that about Brazilians or Chinese that have been lessons to adjust to, but the basic dynamics end up being amazingly familiar, and that does give us an important point of reference.
Cleo from Brazil has asked, we can see that in emerging companies like Vale, we still have the culture of command and control. Could we say that is more common in these companies from your experience?
Great to hear from you, Cleo. Thanks for all of your help. Yes and no. I mean, command and control is alive and well in every part of the world that I've ever worked in. And it also varies much, much more between industry and between organizations within a country than it does systematically between countries. Yeah, I mean, I think that the top-down dynamics of comparing, Brazil and Canada, I think those are pretty representative of national culture. But I think if they also reflect a lot of what works in the mining industry, and even Inco in Canada. It's run a lot like a mining company, like mining companies any place around the world. And I think that there's a lot of examples of organizations that are trying to move from a command and control style to a more distributed, more empowered organization that's better at managing complexity. But I see those differences strongly in every country that we've ever worked with. In some ways, that's how all organizations evolve. And and that may mean that we run into those a bit more often in emerging market countries or in Brazil. But we also run into that all over the world.
I think we might have time for one or two more questions.
Sure.
Caroline asks, was there any shift in natural staff attrition throughout the change? Was there growth in
staffing number?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, there were in both GE and in Vale for different reasons. In GE, the acquiring the talent to make this work and sorting out the dynamics between the three different subcultures of DO, Zymed, and GE corporate meant a fair number of people coming in and out in one of the world's most fluid labor markets. In Vale, people who could only operate in kind of a command and control environment, as Cleo was raising, many of them left, and again, bringing in, recruiting, building the team that's more and more professional all the time meant, quite a bit of transition both in and out.
Well, maybe one more.
Sure.
We'll do one more.
Good, great question.
This one looks really good. Raphael has asked, what are the lessons for organizations still owned by governments, such as PDVSA in Venezuela or Ecopetrol in Colombia?
Oh, good to hear from you guys. Really, really good question. I think the first lesson from that is it can be done. The first lesson is there's lots of lessons. PDVSA, can learn from a lot of different organizations. State-owned companies do, as they grow up, become competitors on the global stage. Petronas is one of the organizations that we've had the privilege to work with over the last year or so. And yes, within their home country, they're a monopoly. But as production expands globally, as their markets expand globally, they're in global competition with everybody, the best around the world. And I think that for now, and we can continue to talk about this, there's two big lessons. The first one is from our summary, put your own house in order internally before you pack your bags to go global, because a strong base from which to grow is really important. You have to have those well under control. You have to be up for the challenge. And the second one is find out who you admire that's out there in your industry or in another industry, because that's one of the most exciting features of our times, is that you have companies from emerging markets all over the world that are becoming big global players on a scale we've never seen before. So go get the BCG Global Challengers. This isn't a commercial for BCG, but it's a good piece of work. It's cited in our book. And find out who you want to study up on as to how they've gone global, because it can be done and it is being done. Thank you, though. That's a great question.
All right, well, we might have to wrap up today. Dan, thank you so much for a wonderful three-part series.
Thank you.
And thanks everybody for joining today. Hope that you enjoyed it as well. Before we depart, I just wanted to let you know that we'll be emailing you a link to the recording of today's webinar. And also, I wanted to remind you that 3 of today's attendees will be randomly selected as winners of free signed copies of Dan's book, and we'll be following up with you after the webinar via email as well. So thank you. That'll do it for today.
Okay, thanks very much. We hope that we hear from you soon. Our last slide in here also talks about, if you're interested in the book, we have lots of different promotions that we're doing here for the summer when the book's first out. So let us know if any of these ideas sound interesting to you. Thanks very much, and we hope we hear from you soon. Thank you.